We continue now at the top of Daf Chaf Beis and Beis in Meseches Nazir. This is Nazir Daf 22b. The Gemara says, Mar Zutra Bereder Rav Mori Omar. Mar Zutra, the son of Rav Mori, says, Hai Hainu de Rami Bar Chama. This, what we're discussing before, is actually the question of Rami Bar Chama. And Rashi over here explains, Mar Zutra Bereder Rav Mori Omar. Hadmi Boilon Hacha. This question that we're dealing with over here. Isha shenodra b'nazir. Let's say you have a woman, she makes a vow to be a nazir. V'shama chaverta v'amra v'ani, and her friend hears her and says, v'ani, I also am going to become a nazir. V'shama ba'ala shal rishona v'hafirla. And then the husband of the first woman, he hears about it and he annuls the vow for her. Afilu l'man amar ba'al megas gayis. So we had a possibility on the previous Amud. For example, we brought in Rabbi Shimon's opinion on the previous Amud. We had a possibility that even according to the one who says that the husband is just severing the vow from this point in time and forward, still we might say that not only is the husband's wife, the first woman, not only is her vow annulled, but the second woman's vow is also annulled because she's completely tying her vow to the first woman's vow. So Hainu de boy Rami Bar Chama, that idea is the same as the question of Rami Bar Chama, Beperakama in the Meseches Nedarim, in the first parak of Meseches Nedarim. And that's what the Gemara over here says. Again, Hainu de Rami Bar Chama, de boy Rami Bar Chama, because Rami Bar Chama asked the following question. Harei olai kibsar zevach shalomim mahu. Let's say a person says, this particular piece of meat is going to be treated for me like the meat of a carbon shalomim. Rashi says, Harei olai kibsar zivchei shalomim kegon shemunach lefonav besar zevach shalomim. For example, you have in front of the individual the meat of a shalomim, umachis nami de'terakame, and there's also a piece of meat that is mutter in front of him. V'yomar zeh kozen. He says, this piece of meat should be like that piece of meat. Mahu, so what's the halacha? Mahu, what is the halacha in that situation? And the Gemara explains the question. Ki mitvis inish bi'ikara mitvis, is the person associating it with the zevach shlamim, meaning to say the shlamim before the blood was sprinkled. The zevach shlamim before the blood is sprinkled is a prohibited item, and he's saying, I'm comparing the two pieces of meat in terms of the fact that this is like a prohibited piece of meat from a carbon shlamim. Rashi over here says, Ki mitvis inish bi'ikara mitvis, ki dehavan hani zivchei shlamim kodem zrika, meaning I'm associating this piece of meat with the carbon shlamim before the sprinkling of the blood, the asira, and in that situation the neder would take effect and the piece of meat would be prohibited. Odilmor maybe bitzinona matvis, maybe he's associating it with a carbon shlamim after the blood is already sprinkled at a time when it's already permitted. And Rashi over here explains, Odilma bitzinona matvis behetera di ispe, meaning to say there is a concept of shlamim that's mutter. After you sprinkle the blood, the carbon shlamim is mutter. V'hainu la'achar zrika shutter basar ba'achila v'sharia. After you sprinkle the blood, you can eat the meat of a carbon shlamim. Bitzinona, what does the word bitzinona mean? Hainu levasof. It means to say at the end. Eventually, the carbon shlamim becomes mutter. T'chol davar shucham mitzdanin levasof. Things that are hot, they become cold. That's where the word sinona comes to. They become cold as time goes on. And the point over here is the same logic can be applied to the case of the woman who makes a neder. Ki amra va'ani, when she says I, and she's associating her nazirus with the other woman's nazirus, so so if you say that she's going to the essence, the original nazirus, so then have a look, so then we're saying, she's saying I'm associating my nazirus with her nazirus, and that applies before she has any annulment. If her nazirus gets annulled, mine will not be annulled. But if you say that she's even associating it with the eventuality, so have a look, then she's really saying that if the first woman's vow is going to be annulled, then mine will be annulled as well. That again is the issue over here. Ki mitzvahs inish bi'ikara mitzvahs, odilma b'tzinina mitzvahs. But the Gemara says, mi dami, but can you really compare the two cases? Can you really compare the case with the pieces of meat to the case with the women who are becoming nazirin? Hasam over there, Kavan da Amar Harei Olai Kivsar Zevach Shlamim. Since the person says that this piece of meat is going to be treated for me like the meat of a carbon shlamim. Avagav de la'achar shenizrak damo motzi achale bachutz. Now, even though by a carbon shlamim, after you sprinkle the blood, you can eat that carbon shlamim outside of the Beis HaMikdash. But Mikdash Kaddish, but there is still some sanctity over there. Meaning to say, it's possible to say when a person says Besar Zevach Shlamim that he actually was referring to the shlamim after Zerika, because there is some kedusha in that case, and he mistakenly thought that he can create the neder in that fashion, and that wouldn't be a good neder. But over here, if you think that the woman is saying she wants to be like her friend after the hafara, ha'hafir la bala, there's already an annulment, that would mean nothing. There's no way that that's what she means. And so therefore you can't really compare the two questions. By the Besar Zevach Shlomim, there really is a possibility that the individual is bitzinin amatvis. But how can you say there's such a possibility when we're talking about one woman associating her nazirus with the nazirus of another? But the Gemara says, Ika Diamri, there are those that say, nevertheless, Hainu Durami Bar Chama Vadai. Certainly the two questions are identical. The issue by the woman associating her nazirus with another woman is identical as the issue with an individual who's associating the prohibition by a piece of meat with Besar Zevach Shlomim. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. Amrullah, let's say one woman says to another, Hareini Nazira Bikvayich, I am a Nazira in your footsteps. Again, a similar question to the above question. Mahu, what's the halacha? Hareini Bikvayich Bekula Milsa V'Sharia, is she completely following in her footsteps? And if the Nazirus of the first woman is annulled, so she also will be permitted. Odilmer maybe Kimekami delay for Labala Vasir. It just means I am like you before there was an annulment, and in that case she would be prohibited. And Rashi over here explains, Hareini Bikvayich Uva Bala Shal Rishon V'Hafirla. Again, the husband of the first woman comes and annuls the vow for her. Aliba Demadam Rabal Megas Gayas. Again, this question is according to the one who says that all the husband does is sever the vow from this point in time forward. So what would be the halacha? Mi'amrinon had to kamar la hareini b'gvayich b'kulei milsa mashma im l'nazirus im l'hefer. Doesn't mean I am in your footsteps. Whatever happens to you happens to me. If it's annulled by you, it's annulled by me. V'keven tehefer ba'al rishonim ishtariya nami chaverta. And since the husband annuls the first one, so the second one is also mutter. V'hai b'gvayich mashma basof. Again, a similar idea to the above. B'gvayich means that we're following you until the end, whatever the eventuality is. Maybe it means no, like you were before the annulment. The mashma kamo damra hareini nazira kamosayich atsof nazirosayich dainu samach laafara debal the nazirusa moshchaviyaz la'ad shafar labal means to say until the point of annulment, but not beyond. Uchashafar labal ozla besof nazirusa. Once there's already an annulment, so that's the end of the first person's nazirus, but the second woman would still be a nazir. Uliola mekami delayfer labal ka'amra. She means I'm associating my nazirus with your nazirus before there's an annulment. And even if there is an annulment, still that second woman, she would still be a nazira. And the Gemara continues, Tashma, coming here a proof from our Mishnah, Ha'isha shenadra b'nazir v'shamar ba'al of yamar v'ani, a woman takes a vow to be a nazir, and her husband hears, and he says, and I also will be a nazir, Eino yachol lahafir. So the Mishnah said he's not able to annul the vow. The point over there was, if he annuls her vow, then his vow is also going to be annulled, and of course a person cannot annul his own vow. And the Gemara says, V'salka daitach kiyamar lo hareini b'gvayich. Now if you think that when a person says, hareini b'gvayich, when the person says, I am in your footsteps, b'ikara kamatvis, so the association is with the ikar nazirus, it doesn't matter about the later annulment. So we should say the same thing by the husband, leifer lo ledida, he should annul her vow, v'lukim didei, and his vow will be maintained. Why is there any problem over here? Why can't we simply say, he annuls her vow, and his vow is maintained? And so the Gemara says, Elalav shvamina, rather don't we see from this, Bekula de milsa mitzvahs, the association is, in terms of whatever happens to the wife, is going to happen to the husband's vow as well. So when hers is annulled, his is annulled, and that's why it's a problem for him to annul her vow. V'hilka chud lo matzi mefer, and that's why he's not able to annul the vow. Ha'isha de'amra hareini b'gvayich hinami muteris, and that would imply that in the case where a woman says, my nazirus is in the footsteps of your nazirus, so when the nazirus of the first woman is annulled, so too the nazirus of the second woman would be annulled. And the Gemara answers, Lo no, liolam bikara mitzvahs. Really, when the person associates the nazirus, it's with the ikar nazirus. It means before the annulment. And so then again, the question is, why can't the husband just annul his wife's vow and his vow will remain? V'hacha, but over here in this case, kevan do amar la va'ani. Since the husband said to his wife, va'ani, I also will be a nazir like you, ka'omer kayim lechi dami. That's as if he's saying, I am upholding your vow. V'imishal hakama. So now, if he asks and undoes the hakama, he undoes the upholding of the vow, Motzi Mefer, then he would be able to annul the vow. Lo, however, if he doesn't undo his hakama, he's not able to annul the vow. The real reason he can't annul his wife's vow is because he already did hakama in this situation. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Hareini Nazir Viat. Let's say the husband says, I am a Nazir, and you also. V'yamra Amen, and she says, Amen. So Mefer es Shalah, then he's able to annul her vow, V'shalo Kayim, but his vow will remain. And the Gemara says, we have the following contradiction. The Tosefta says, Hareini Nazir Viat, if the husband says to his wife, I am a Nazir and you, V'amra Amen, so if she says Amen, Shneim Asurin, so then they both become prohibited, they're both going to have the status of Nazir. V'imlav, and if not, if she doesn't say Amen, so Shneim Mutar, and actually both of them are Mutter, the Naziris doesn't take effect at all, not for her and not for him, Mibnei Shatala Nidra B'Nidra, because he's making his neder dependent on her neder. Now, the point over here is, if the Tosefta is saying that his neder is dependent on her neder, that would imply that if he annuls her neder, his neder will also be annulled. And so the Gemara says, no, that's not what it implies. Amar Rav Yehuda says, Tani Mefer es Shalah v'Shalo Kayim. Even in this Tosefta, you can learn that he annuls her vow and his vow remains. Meaning to say that in terms of whether the vows are chal, each one is dependent one on the other. His vow is only going to be chal if her vow is chal. But once the two nedarim are chal, so that in terms of hafara, in terms of annulment, he could annul her vow and his vow will remain. But the Gemara continues, Abaya says, Afilu teimu k'dikatoni brisa. You could even say, as the brisa itself seems to imply, Kagon de'ka'amar lo hareini nazir va'at, because the case could be as follows. In the case of the brisa, he says to her, I am a nazir and you, and he makes it as a definitive statement. De'katali nidro b'nidra. In the brisa, he is saying, my neder, he's saying his neder is totally dependent upon her neder. There's no question that the two nedarim are dependent one upon the other, and this is not true in the Mishnah. We'll continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Chav Gimel Amud Aleph.